All right, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mary, who is our moderator for the final panel. The floor is yours.
Andrea, can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you. So, since I've come to the War College, it's my first foray into full-time academics. I have a lot of other careers before I went there, and a lot of people don't realize that. I guess that's good. But the reason they probably don't expect me to have done something else is when I get involved in something, I become a real geek in that. I become very passionate about it, and if I can't keep that passion running, it's time to move on. And so I found, why did I pick this job? And I need to tell you a little story. Why did I pick this institution at the time over Purdue? First of all, it was on the water, but that's kind of an aside. When I got there and I went through the interview, I was up against 59 other candidates. It was one place where I did not have to change my resume one word at the time for the description of the job, which is incredible. And I thought I might have a chance at getting this. So what was the real decision? I feel, as an educator there, I think most educators feel this in general, that you make a difference in the world. Education is imperative to the future of our societies, and in particular, I get to teach people that are going to be responsible for our military. They are the future decision makers of the U.S. military, so that's why I'm there. So that's why I wanted to I'm sorry, yes, Rear Admiral Kasivi. I met him several years ago when he came to the War College. I always forget that piece. It is a great international body, and he's a replication of what happens with the international cadre there. They become the leaders of their militaries or leaders of their countries. And so he's really representative of that. So that gives you a clue as to the types of folks that we have coming through there. They're just remarkable people, and they come with this vast body of experience. So I'm also teaching folks with a lot of exposure to real life, and that's what I enjoy. So that's why I wanted to do this panel on education. I think, and I also saved it till last because I think of all the things we've talked about, this is one key area that needs to be inculcated with women, peace, and security, or some type of information relative to that. And you saw our video at the War College as to what we're trying to promote with that. So let me introduce you to the three panelists we have today. All of them I consider really qualified experts in the field of education. And so Kerry Foley, to my immediate left, is an instructional designer and multimedia producer with 10 years of experience working in higher education. She also told me at lunch she's headed into her first course where she's going to be teaching a course in this field. So we're pretty excited about that. She began her career as a multimedia producer at Harvard Medical School. She currently works as the manager of course design for the Department of Digital Teaching and Learning at Harvard Division of Continuing Education. And next to her, we have Leslie Van Buskirk. She's a project specialist at Our Secure Future, and she provides both research and programmatic support to that group. And most recently, Lexie supported the establishment of a new initiative titled Mobilizing Male Allies for Women, Peace, and Security. And then last but absolutely not least, my friend, colleague, and associate now for, I think, a decade, right, Lauren? We have Lauren Mackenzie up from Marine Corps University. And she has a really interesting role there. She's a professor of military cross-cultural competence at the Center for Advanced Operational Culture Learning at Marine Corps University. She conducts research relating to cross-cultural competence, oversees cultural-related curriculum development and outcomes assessment, and delivers communication and culture lectures across the professional military education spectrum. So we have three very different viewpoints, and I'm going to let you announce what you might be talking about. And please go. Kerry, you're ready?
Just one at a time, or are we going right into our talks?
You go right into your talk.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kerry Foley, and thank you, Mary, for that nice introduction. I don't think I've ever been called an expert in this, so that was a first. I'll try, though. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that I'm working on with Mary for her course at the Extension School, which is a course that she teaches called Ideas About Leadership. So to give you just a quick overview of what I'll talk about, I just wanted to introduce sort of what my department and my team does, and then how I got to know Mary, and then what our project is at this point. Full disclosure, it's still in development, so I'm really hoping during the Q&A portion you may have some ideas for me that I have my pen here, I'm going to write them all down, and that hopefully we can incorporate them into what we're designing. So Mary mentioned I'm an instructional designer, and so I don't know how many of you are familiar with that field. Typically, instructional designers work directly with subject matter experts in a field, and they design some kind of educational intervention or course. We do it a little bit differently at Extension, where we're very faculty focused. So we do work with subject matter experts, but they're actually the faculty. And typically we do not design their full course for them, and instead we actually just offer them support in some kind of either a project or an intervention. And we refer to them as teach partnerships. And so basically they're faculty led. The faculty comes to us and says, I want to do this really cool thing. How do I do it? And my team offers support in many different ways. So there are learning designers, we have multimedia producers, we have animators, we have sort of the full gamut of software developers and stuff like that. And so I have a really cool job where I get to work in all these different courses in different subject matters, and I get to learn all about it, and then I get to make cool things. So it's really fun. So in terms of the project that I'm working on right now, Mary came to us with this super cool course that gets really great evaluations, and students get a ton out of it. So my favorite types of projects are the ones that are innovative and not the ones where people come to me and need lots of help and they like the course isn't doing well. So this was an innovator one, which is awesome. And the big thing that we talked about was that it's really important to think about gender when you're teaching about leadership. So as a leader, you really should be considering gender when you're making leadership decisions. And so as Mary and I talked a little bit more about this, she revealed to me that a lot of people just gloss over this. I don't know if maybe it's a product of not wanting to make gender sort of out there in front of everyone because people think maybe incorporating it too much is actually like problematic. But in reality, it's actually very important to think about this stuff when you're leading. So we thought a little bit about it and how do we instill it in people that this is a really important thing to think about. And so we discussed it a little bit and we started to think about empathy, basically, right? So how do we get people to see and feel what other people are thinking and feeling? And so this is something that comes up a lot when we design any type of intervention for leadership classes or management classes. These topics or these skills that people refer to as soft skills that are absolutely not soft skills. They're very important skills, but there's no right or wrong answer to them. So it's not black and white. It's, these are courses that live in the gray. And so how do you really get people to practice and to understand what decision-making is if there's no right or wrong answer and you can't just say, yes, you did the right thing. And so it's really hard. And so I started to research this a little bit and came across some of the research on empathy and Simon Sinek, who is many of you may be familiar with him, he's a motivational speaker and he writes a lot of books on motivational and inspirational leadership. And his big point is that empathy is one of the biggest skill sets you can have as a leader. And I thought, okay, well, how do you teach it? So then I started looking into how to teach it. Turns out there's no actual hard and fast algorithm for this, but there are some proven techniques that work. Modeling and teaching point of views is really important. Looking at perspectives through literature and history is really important. But the big thing for me is metacognition. So thinking about how you're thinking about these things. And metacognition is also another thing that's not that easy to teach either, right? So practice is a big piece of it. So taking one step further, we thought, okay, well, how do we get people to practice metacognition, empathy, and decision-making, and gender, right? So there's all these things kind of coming in. So the idea that we came up with was to create a series of branching scenarios. Are you guys, anyone here familiar with branching scenarios? They're pretty much what they sound like. Basically, you're given a scenario that's rooted in some kind of real-world context. Typically, you don't get a lot of information, so you don't know all of the context, but you have the bits and pieces that maybe you would see at the sort of the outset of a problem. And then you start to make decisions, and based on those decisions, the scenario changes. So if I go one way, things change. It's kind of like a choose-your-own adventure. But the important part for this scenario is that when you make a decision, you learn what the person on the other side was thinking or feeling. So you're getting a sense of, okay, this is a person, not just a scenario. And I didn't realize that when I made this decision, they were actually going to feel this way. I forgot all these other little pieces of the context that actually make up this person as a human being. It didn't occur to me. And so then from there, you make the next decision and you see it again, and you think, oh my gosh, people have like a lot of layers, right? There's a lot of things that go into this. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to these scenarios, but they give you an opportunity to practice thinking about how you're thinking about things and approaching problems and how they differ from somebody else's perspective. along the way, they're also going to kind of run into, okay, wait, there was a little bit more to the story that I didn't know, right? So anyone that's managed someone knows, like, they come to you with a problem and you think you can come up with a solution, and you go and then you find out, well, actually, there's more to that problem that this person didn't tell me, and now I kind of solved it in a way that I would not have solved it had I known a little bit more. So basically, the hope through this is that they'll start to reflect on their own thinking and their own ability to empathize with the situation, but also get this sort of sense of, oh, there's a human dimension to this. So that being said, we are still very much in the process of developing this scenario, and one of the ideas that we have and that we're basing some of this on is the Elizabeth I survival games. Is anyone familiar with the scenario? Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about it, or should I just kind of? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, well, basically, this is a similar. It's not quite a survival game, but Elizabeth I was the first female queen of England.
Yes.
Yes.
Most people know the story of her. She's fighting religion, she's fighting power, she's fighting the Spanish. So the military, yeah, why not? She's fighting the Spanish.
Don't mention the French.
Yeah.
And she's also fighting to really be an effective leader. So it's just this great cross dynamic
Yes.
case study.
And you
Yeah.
can look back through history and you can think, okay, well, if she made this decision, this is what the outcomes could have been, or if she made this one. And so people that don't have a ton of knowledge about the subject will start to make decisions based on their own context of, like, oh, well, I would fight for religion, I wouldn't fight for, public safety or something. And then you realize, okay, well, that just cost her the crown, because now all of a sudden there's a war, right? And so basically the hope behind going through the scenario is just to realize, like, oh, okay, wait, there were other things I was supposed to be thinking about here. How would I have done it differently? And so that's just one, really basic scenario. It's obviously quite outdated at this point, so our students probably won't completely relate to the scenario. But the hope is that whichever one that we end up with, or the several that we do, will allow the students to root it in their own context. And so we think in our office a lot about Fink's taxonomy, which is this sort of framework for learning design where, you have the foundational knowledge, but actually students go a lot further. So the first question we always ask is, like, what do you want your students to know in 5 or 6 years? And it's usually not something foundational, right? It's, okay, I want my students to know that a lot goes into decision making and they need to think about gender when they're leading, right? So that's not something that you just pick up in a book. So the important part of this is that it goes into a human dimension and a learning how to learn dimension. And so that's what I'm hoping that this scenario, or this series of scenarios, will be for this course. So that being said, I will stop there, and I hope that you might give me some ideas for what you would like to see in a potential scenario, and we can build it in.
Okay, thank
So.
you very much. Leslie?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lexie Van Buskirk, and I'm from Our Secure Future. My colleague Katie was on the last panel. I just wanted to begin by thanking the Watson Institute, the Naval War College Foundation, and particularly Dr. Raum for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm thrilled to be here discussing women, peace, and security in education with you this afternoon. I just wanted to begin by sharing a bit of a personal anecdote. Last week I was in London with one of our sister programs from the One Earth Future Foundation called Oceans Beyond Piracy. They were launching their report on maritime security in 2017, specifically the state of piracy off the Horn of Africa. And the launch of SOP was to the military, partly to the military space, predominantly to shipping and industry within the maritime space. And I was speaking with a man after the panel had concluded, and he was telling me about his work for a security consultancy in London. He was telling me that he'd recently graduated. He had a degree in international relations. And when I asked him how women, peace, and security intersected with the work that he was doing for this security consultancy in London, he laughed at me. And he said, well, typically we only take on jobs and projects that actually make us money. We don't take on jobs that don't have anything to do with the maritime space. And that got me thinking. And luckily, we have been doing all this work on the annotated bibliography, so I had a couple statistics up my sleeve that I was able to rattle off rather quickly to make the argument for the effectiveness of women, peace, and security across disciplines, even within the maritime space, shockingly enough. And I could sort of see as we were conversing that the light bulb started to go off above his head, and something kind of switched in his brain. And when I left from my Airbnb later that day, I was thinking to myself, how different might that conversation have gone if he had had women, peace, and security and a gender perspective included in his education at some point along the line. And it's largely due to this experience that I'm really thrilled to be here today to discuss strategies for improving the way that we teach women, peace, and security in both educational and training settings. The findings and recommendations that I'll be presenting today are from our recent policy brief titled Grooming the Next Generation of Foreign Policymakers, Women, Peace, and Security in Practice. The information in this brief was captured at the inaugural Women, Peace, and Security Curriculum Consortium, which we hosted in partnership with the Naval War College and Peace is Loud last August, and we piggybacked off of the Naval War College conference. And the idea for our consortium originated from several months of consultations with academics, policy practitioners, and women peace builders as well, during which time we identified a few important shifts in the women, peace, and security field. The first is that there's an increasing demand from students to increase the number of educational and training materials available on women, peace, and security. The second is that there's also an increasing number of women, peace, and security training materials produced by a multitude of multidisciplinary institutions. We felt that the convergence of these two shifts presented us with a really unique opportunity to strengthen the women, peace, and security community of practice by providing a space for exploration, dialogue, and a sharing of resources. We brought together 25 thought leaders on women, peace, and security, ranging from the military and civilian sectors, from academia as well as the policy side, to come together to discuss how to groom the next generation of women, peace, and security thought leaders. We wanted to focus on really addressing the people that are going to be leaving the classroom settings and implementing the women, peace, and security agenda over the months and years to come. Ultimately, we left the room with a surprising amount of consensus, especially given the diverse range of actors and viewpoints that we had in the room. Our first task was to discuss and clarify the current state of women, peace, and security education and trainings, and immediately our group identified that, as many of you in this room probably already know, women, peace, and security is a lot more than just a catchphrase or a buzzword. It's an overarching agenda and framework with policy and legal commitments to back it up. Given the weight of these commitments, including individual country commitments in the form of national action plans and now in the US with the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017, now more than ever there's a need to cultivate gender expertise skill sets amongst our future leaders. However, as of right now, most of the women, peace, and security education is created ad hoc and is mostly done in silos. And that leads to a disconnect between the theory of women, peace, and security as a framework and its implementation in practice. We hoped that we could start to address this gap by further clarifying some of the challenges, opportunities, and finally making recommendations for next steps. Throughout our conversation, to identify basic challenges that some of these institutions have faced, we were surprised to find that many of our participants, even those from vastly different sectors, had been facing similar hurdles. I'd like to note that due to time constraints today, I'm not going to cover everything that we discussed during the day, but if you'd like more information, there are some policy briefs available. Please grab them. The fewer I have to take back to Colorado, the lighter my luggage will be. So first, we identified that there's an overarching lack of information sharing and transparency, both within and across the sectors. And related to this, many of our participants identified a persisting culture of competition, which creates a perceived or actual lack of transparency, which then reinforces a lack of trust amongst stakeholders. And this dynamic ultimately becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the less you feel that you can trust your partners, the less you're going to share and the less they're going to share with you. We also identified that there is a lack of agreed upon core competencies that could potentially serve as a baseline for women, peace, and security education and trainings in the future. Given the wide variety of educational and training settings in which WPS is currently being taught, as well as the wide variety of jobs that students are going to be entering into that will require gender expertise, now more than ever, we need to be equipping them to leave the classroom setting and then do this on the ground. We also identified that even today, different stakeholders are using different definitions and terminology when teaching women, peace, and security. And many of our participants highlighted just how problematic it is that some view WPS as a standalone discipline that should be taught in and of itself, and some view it as a lens that can be placed over the top of any other discipline and any other course that you teach. And this is a subtle but really crucial distinction that creates additional confusion and further hinders the WPS community of practice from being able to level the playing field for both academics and practitioners alike. So just as we saw in identifying some of the key challenges that we're facing, our group's insights revealed that in terms of strategies that have worked for them to implement WPS trainings, they have more in common than not, even across the sectors. One of the strategies that we identified, and this is something that has actually come up across the panels at this conference as well, is how important it is to have support and buy-in from the top. Many of our academics in particular recognized that senior level support is crucial and can either make or break your ability to include a gender perspective in course and curriculum development. And this was particularly true at Tufts University, where administration provided additional funding to hire teaching assistants specifically so they could assist professors with integrating a gender perspective into their existing courses. Furthermore, we identified, and this is kind of the flip side of this coin, we identified that it's really important to encourage groundswell from the bottom. And at the National Defense University, for example, students used Peace Loud's Women, War, and Peace screening series in a box to help lobby their administration to include gender perspective across more of their courses. Another successful strategy was used by Monash University in Australia. They formed a Women, Peace, and Security network, which connected academics with practitioners to build strong collaborative relationships within the group. And this provided students and their teachers with a tangible model of what their careers might look like once they step outside of the training or classroom setting. We also identified that it's crucial that we continue, or in some cases start, to collaborate across the sectors. And I think the U.S. Naval War College conference is a really great example of the power of convenings and just how much tangible work can come out of even just 2 days of conversations within a safe space. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in addition to clarifying the challenges and the solutions that we've been facing, we were able to create a specific list of recommendations to move the conversation ahead. Overall, we developed a list of the following 5 recommendations that both academics and practitioners alike can do to support the development of a cohesive women, peace, and security curriculum. First, map the field collectively and produce an inventory of strategies that create a culture open to women, peace, and security and to gender analysis. Ultimately, only by identifying what's worked as well as what hasn't worked will academics and educators be able to capitalize on these strategies. Plus, if we can leverage every opportunity to change this existing culture to make the culture more open and inclusive, we'll be able to identify the many more entry points and have a much easier time accessing and leveraging them where they are. Second, create opportunities for the women, peace, and security community of practice to collaborate more regularly. We found that, again, even though we only gathered for 1 day last August, that 1 day and the diversity of our group and the opportunity to reach across the sectors to collaborate produced really impactful results. Third, integrate women, peace, and security and gender analysis across courses and disciplines. And this gets back to the challenge that I mentioned earlier of having different ways of discussing and teaching women, peace, and security. Rather than treating women, peace, and security as a standalone issue, instead treat it as a cross-disciplinary, cross-sector lens that can be applied to issues, even the maritime space, for example. Fourth, recognize and seize the opportunity to connect the women, peace, and security agenda to domestic issues. And I recognize that many traditional understandings of WPS tend to look exclusively to the external and focus abroad. We think, however, that a more sophisticated understanding of women, peace, and security would look inwards and would reflect security as a human security element that is something that happens to every person within every society. Our fifth and final recommendation is for the women, peace, and security community of practice to establish a set of minimum core competencies, things that every women, peace, and security training or educational program should include at bare minimum. These core competencies are crucial because at the end of the day, we want academics, policy practitioners, and military personnel to view the framework of women, peace, and security in the same way. And here I want to take a step back for just a moment and acknowledge that there was some initial sensitivity to the possibility of imposed standards across institutions. Particularly our academic colleagues were concerned about core competencies being forced into programs where they may not make sense. Ultimately, however, we feel that this list gains considerable credibility just given the fact that it was developed and agreed upon by such a diverse group of actors. Our first core competency is to implement a clear understanding of gender and what gender and having a gender perspective means. And this might seem fairly obvious to many of us in the room. However, to those unfamiliar with discourses around gender, it's a vital foundational stepping stone that can serve as a gateway to the other core competencies. Our second core competency is a working knowledge of the women, peace, and security legal and policy frameworks, including the history of the women, peace, and security movement. Not only do students need to know what the agenda is, what it requires, and how it can make us more effective, they need to know how to leverage these policy and legal commitments to do their work better. The third core competency is an understanding of the importance of women peace builders' expertise and perspectives, and the ability to use their feedback to inform policy decision-making at the top. We ultimately want to ensure that policy and programming is informed by a holistic understanding of the security environment you're working in, which means that they're going to have to provide a feedback loop from the grassroots back up to the grass tops, and obviously we have to recognize that the grassroots are important to engage in the first place. Our final competency is the ability to conduct a gender analysis and provide actionable recommendations from your findings. And here I just want to circle back to the conversation that I had in London last week, because I can't help but wonder that if women, peace, and security and the ability to do a gender analysis is something that this man had been taught in his career, whether he might understand that there's a crucial connection between the incorporation of a gender perspective, even in fields that are traditionally masculine that we don't necessarily identify as fields that require a gender lens. Gender analysis is also something that can cut across disciplines and sectors, which makes it a powerful transformative tool. And I know that, speaking from my own experience, I've only been working in this space for a little over a year, but once you put the gender lens on, you can't take it off. Everything else that you see, no matter what it is that you come across, has a gender lens from there on out. So together we feel that the implementation of these recommendations, particularly our identified core competencies, could help trainers and educators to bridge the gap between women, peace, and security theory and practice, and better teach their students how to do women, peace, and security in the field. When coupled with the information that we gathered about some common challenges as well as strategies for success, we hope that this brief can serve as a starting point for the development of a more collaborative, cohesive, and effective women, peace, and security agenda. And I will leave it at that. Happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to begin by recognizing the great interdisciplinary collaboration in this room. I can't remember the last time I've been in a conference with a veterinarian, lawyers, cyber professionals, military professionals, and a range of social scientists all together kind of speaking the same language. And I think it really speaks volumes to the applicability and utility of women, peace, and security. So it's just been very enlightening and very exciting to be part of this. I'm going to build on what both Kerry and Lexie talked about now and offer a little bit of a deep dive just to build on, as Lexie mentioned, grooming the next generation of WPS leaders. She mentioned the importance of not necessarily just teaching gender in a specific standalone course, but the importance of sometimes integrating WPS topics and concerns into classes like leadership, or in my case, in a class devoted to culture, cross-cultural competence, or intercultural communication. So this presentation is designed to kind of elevate our understanding of how culture education can broaden women, peace, and security efforts, and along the same lines, how women, peace, and security can broaden how we think about the applicability and utility of culture education. So on that note of interdisciplinary focus, I want to begin. So the title of my presentation, as you might have noticed, is The Broadening Effect. And for those of you who are familiar with positive psychology, you might be familiar with the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who about 15 or 16 years ago, came up with this idea of the broaden and build theory, which states that positive emotions, so things like joy, happiness, increase the number of potential behavioral options we perceive as available to us. So let that sink in for just a second. This idea that when we are experiencing positive emotions, right, it also expands what she calls our thought action repertoires. Again, the options we feel available to us in the way that we respond to instances of complexity. And so just to make that connection then to culture and WPS, one of the outcomes of the courses that I teach in intercultural communication is communication resourcefulness. Right? In education, we are not preparing necessarily for the known. We're preparing students for the unknown. We're helping them anticipate complexity. We're helping them anticipate the unpredictable nature of military operations. And as a result, we just want to help them become more resourceful, especially, again, I'm a little bit biased to communication because that's my background. But again, I'm very focused on the interpersonal nature So just as communication resourcefulness is a key outcome of culture education, I would argue also that expanding our perception of what is possible in instances of interpersonal complexity is also a key WPS concern. And in this moment, I want to take a second to also kind of, speaking of broaden our idea of what culture is. Because I mean, for some of you, especially some of you in uniform, you might just have had culture training, do's and don'ts, don't show the bottom of your foot, don't use your left hand, things like that, right? Don't do this. So of course, got it. In some instances, of course, when you know exactly where you're going, that just-in-time training is very valuable. I did that for many years in universities as study abroad, pre-departure training. So I buy into it as important. But in instances of culture education, right, we want to take that a bit further. We want to think about culture, to use your words, Lexie, as a lens that actually goes over our eyes and colors the way that we see the world. So we are essentially, with our culture education, helping Marines, because I work for a Marine Corps University, right, we're helping them deal with people who look at the world differently than they do. So I also teach classes on cultural metacognition, so thank you for that plug, Kerry. I think that is the key. Like, thinking about how we think is so important. I'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to kind of make the case that even though it doesn't seem directly applicable, that I think culture education can be a natural platform for advancing WPS topics and concerns. I'm very lucky to say this is my 5th year presenting for Mary's conference. It's been such a joy. And in years past, I have talked about specific instances, especially in a very large online course that I oversee. I've talked about some specific kind of educational interventions that we've used to help Marines think about women, peace, and security and culture education as force multipliers. And I will echo that every year I come back, even though it's repetitive, but I still think it's important. And Marine Corps University, so where I come from, I'm at the Center for Advanced Operational Culture Learning, which is our culture center. But I integrate, my job is to infuse culture education into all levels of learning, from lower enlisted to senior officer. And so I try to find different ways and different platforms for advancing what I think is a really important message. But again, because we're small, we don't have a lot of people doing the work of WPS in a deliberate way at my university. And as I've started to try to introduce it over the past few years, I'll often get the, oh yeah, of course, you're the female professor, of course you're doing women, peace, and security. To that I always give this phrase in Arabic that says, just because you have teeth doesn't mean you can be a dentist. Just because you are a woman doesn't mean you can teach women, peace, and security, right? Just because you speak a language doesn't mean you can teach a language, right? These things, of course, need to be taken seriously and looked at specifically as educational opportunities for expanding our students' way that they look at the world. So I think that is a really important point to drive home. This is our website, just FYI, but this is a center I work for, and that's a little bit of context into how I get at women, peace, and security and culture educational intervention. So just in the next 15 minutes, I promise, I know I'm standing between you, 10, and next 10 minutes, I will be quick. I just quickly talk about how I've made the connection between WPS and culture. To what end, right? Why? So this idea of broadening the aperture for helping Marines and students in general understand the broad applicability for this content. And then the how, I'm going to, again, build off of what Kerry said. We don't really use the word empathy, right? It doesn't resonate very well with Marines, but we use words like perspective taking and attributional complexity as skills, culture general skills we're trying to get at in our courseware. So, yeah, so the empathy thing isn't all that well received. Yeah. You have to meet them where they're at. And I'm an outsider as it is. I haven't worn the uniform, right? I'm not male. So I have to be very careful with my words in that sense. And so again, this idea of integrating WPS and culture education, I get at it in a variety of different ways. But as I mentioned before, one way is this idea of the broadening effect. And so just as a really brief story, back about 10 years ago when I first started working in the culture centers, this was the Air Force in Montgomery, Alabama, I was working on developing a video for airmen that would help them prepare for deployments to Iraq. And I was working with a bunch of different Iraqi role players. And I'll never forget this one story one of the Iraqis told me. He had been in the States for a long time. He had been educated in English and in American schools. But he said the first time he ever came to the States, he was with a bunch of his American colleagues, and they were eating dinner at a nice Italian restaurant in New York City. And he said he'll never forget how everyone looked at him when the waiter brought this big plate of spaghetti and put it in the middle of the table, and everyone's serving themselves with their fork and their knives. And what does he do but take his right hand and reach in and grab a big fistful of spaghetti and put it on his plate. And he said, yeah, I know how everybody was looking at me, like I didn't have manners, I didn't know how to eat properly in a nice restaurant. And he said, but step back and think about it from my perspective for just a second. He said, that fork, I have no idea where that fork has been. I have no idea the last time it was washed, when it was on the floor, or what that waiter did with it. I don't know that waiter. I have no idea where it's been. He said, this right hand, I know exactly the last time it was washed, and I know exactly where it's been. In my mind, it makes much more sense to use this hand to eat than to use the fork. Now, since I heard that story, have I changed the way that I eat? No, I eat with a fork and a knife. But having heard that story, have I now broadened the way that I think about the logic for that kind of behavior? Do I step back and pause for just a second before I make a judgment about the way people eat and how polite they are or how I perceive them to be respectful or appropriate? Absolutely. And so it's little instances like that throughout the courses that I teach that I just attempt, right, to broaden Marines, my students' mindsets about what right looks like in different ways of logic and cultural metacognition that can help feed into that. Okay, so just as a couple of things as we're connecting WPS and culture education, again, we see them both as force multipliers, right? We are not going to tell Marines, I'm going to tell them how to do their jobs. I want to help them do their jobs better, right? And so when I talk to Marines, I always quote this colonel that runs our command and staff college. And he says, as a Marine, I will take any advantage I can get. And as I see it, this education gives me and my Marines an advantage. So again, not telling them how to do their jobs, helping them to do their jobs better. We also look, when I see culture and WPS connected, I see them as social constructions, right? Not as this fixed thing that can't evolve or that can't change depending on the context or the relationship that we're in. So that's one way I get at it, through identity and the social construction of identity. Third, both areas of education, I think, are designed to help students ask better questions. At the end of the day, if I had to think about what I want my students to know or do in 5 years, it's ask better questions and not to assume that everything is black and white and that things aren't always what they seem. And that, again, if you can consider the legitimacy of alternative perspectives, I just think you'll be better off in life, never mind, as a Marine. So that's sort of how I get at it. And then the last thing is this importance of encouraging contextualized thinking. And what do I mean by that? A brief overview of a study that was done just a couple of years ago that was looking at the differences in Americans and Chinese and how they tend to assign blame. I put that in air quotes. And one of the things that they found is when they did this study, they surveyed several hundred Americans and several hundred Chinese after asking each participant to read a very short news story. The news story said that some time ago in China, there was a pharmacist who accidentally but incorrectly filled over 200 prescriptions in her day at work one day, causing every single customer in that pharmacy to become sick. Who do you blame? And overwhelmingly, right, the Americans blamed the pharmacist. Right? She has to take responsibilities for her actions. She's the professional. It's her fault. She's the one who did it. She performed the action. Whereas the overwhelming amount of Chinese participants assigned blame to the pharmacy. Right? They were thinking about all the different factors and contextual issues that could have fed into that mistake. How much vacation time did she get this year? Right? What are her working conditions like? What's her supporting staff like? What kind of day was she having? Was her parents sick? Was her child sick? Right? They were thinking about all these things that feed into that action, as opposed to just assigning blame to the individual. And so I think about, with my students, I'm not, again, telling you what to think, but consider in the future, again, when you're so quick to assign blame, right, consider the context. And again, for many of you, this is very low level, but if I'm teaching sergeants or lower enlisted, this is something that I think is a really important message to get across. Okay, so as I mentioned, broadening the aperture, what are some ways I'm getting at this? So again, as I mentioned before, we're looking more broadly at culture as a lens, like eyeglasses that color the way that we see the world, right? We're looking at it as a mindset and a skill set. And so when I teach this over either 4 weeks or a semester, we are getting at a certain kind of mindset and skill set. So I teach a 4-week elective at the Command and Staff College on culture, conflict, and creativity that looks at the ways in which intercultural or multicultural interactions can help us become more creative thinkers. And so can help, again, broaden the way that we think about our options and our resources for dealing with issues of complexity and unintended consequences and things like that. I teach a class to the War College on cultural metacognition that falls under the larger umbrella, so we can talk for sure, that falls under the larger umbrella of creative thinking and systems thinking. I actually contribute to a cultural competence course for sexual assault prevention and response victim advocates for the Marine Corps. So again, when they think about how they can respond to victims who come from different cultural backgrounds, how can you anticipate ways that cultural values will display themselves in communication behavior, right? Does silence mean the same thing? Does eye contact or lack of eye contact mean the same thing, right? Absolutely not. So we help get at that. And then probably the favorite research project I'm working on right now is best practices for working with our international military students. So I'm part of a team that's surveying faculty on the biggest challenges they face working with international students. And as you might imagine, it's really complex. But I use that information from the surveys to feed into a new faculty development seminar on how to help new faculty anticipate the challenges associated with international students in their small conference groups, whether they be male, female, but the idea is that they might look at the world differently. They might look at seminar participation differently than you or a typical American. So I try to get at some of those things. Okay, so just to get to some of the meat and potatoes, I'm trying to do a deep dive here. Do I have 2 minutes or? 2 minutes. Okay, so a sample educational objective. This is for a class, again, at the lower level, probably community college level. But one of the things I'm trying to get after in my classes for objectives is increased attributional complexity. And that is, again, when someone does something that doesn't seem to make sense, that seems to be a little bit weird or disrespectful, right? Can we come up with a variety of explanations for making sense of that behavior as opposed to just falling back on the one that seems most obvious to us? So that's attributional complexity. In the words that students can understand, I say provide multiple explanations for the outcome of a successful or failed intercultural interaction. And I have a whole series of branching exercises for this I'm happy to share. So some of the things that I try to get at is distinguishing between linguistic and communication competence, describing the implications of identity. So to draw from Vanessa Brown's paper, this importance of intersectionality and identity is so important. If I can just get Marines to not think about the world in black and white all the time, right? I feel that's a success. And then third, practicing the skills of perspective taking and perception checking. And so some of you might already be familiar with this, but what does that entail? Considering how another's cultural background shapes their behavior, heightening our expectations about our counterparts' intentions, and helps to reduce confirmation bias as we update stereotypes. So I have this as a sample kind of vignette that I use in my course on Chinese foot binding. Really quick, consider the creative ways in which the skill of perspective taking was used to challenge the practice of foot binding. The practice involved binding young girls' feet tightly, deforming them in an attempt to create the impression of golden lilies that were 4 inches in length. After enduring for nearly 100 years, the practice was ended because it is believed of a letter written by the Confucian scholar Kang Yue asking the emperor to consider how other nations perceived the way China treated its women. Tradition holds that his letter convinced the emperor that nothing caused others to ridicule and look down upon the Chinese more than foot binding. This effective and creative use of perspective taking brought about change for millions of women. And I drew this example from a book called The Honor Code. But this is one way I kind of introduce the importance of perspective taking in a culture course, but introduce a woman, peace, and security type of topic. That's just an example. And then I also, again, this is for young sergeants, but I sometimes will include this cartoon where you see everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture, and on the right, nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And I have the students, again, kind of brainstorm. You don't have to agree with it, but what is the logic? What are the cultural values that are feeding or fueling this perspective? And I just ask them to consider it. You don't have to agree with it. You have to change your behavior. That's what I have to keep telling the Marines. You just have to consider it, right? It'll help you down the road. Okay, I've already gone through this. Okay, so just in closing, again, what are the outcomes? What are the benefits and advantages of considering women, peace, and security, educational interventions more broadly? First, this idea of a growth mindset. If I could summarize 6 decades of literature in intercultural communication, it would be that the best intercultural communicators operate with this growth mindset, right? Focusing on learning how you learn, realization there is always more to learn, and increase our tendency towards exploratory thinking. And then finally, as I mentioned before, this idea of the broadening effect, that again, if we want to go back to leadership and we think about the key components of leadership as integrity and competence, I would argue that communication is the bridge, right? That is the voice or the face of those two characteristics of integrity and competence, right? And a lot of research, at least in my field, shows that if your subordinates perceive you as someone who's attributionally complex, who can come up with multiple explanations for the behavior that you see, that you will be regarded much more highly as an effective leader. So I will end with that. This is my email address. I know I've said a lot in a little time, and I talk fast anyway. So please forgive that kind of rapid fire presentation, but this is something I'm really passionate about and just honored to be part of this conference again, Mary. So thank you for your time today.
So thank you, panelists, for your talks on empathy, metacognition, strategies for teaching WPS, and the broadening effect. And I'd like to open it for the next few minutes for questions, and I need distance now. Elena?
Question is for Laurie. I want to give you a scenario and tell me what you think the solution would be.
Oh, solution. Okay.
So, say our troops are in a foreign country. Okay, now we need to respect the culture and learn about the culture and behave the way we should behave. But say someone is committing a crime in that culture that we consider a criminal act, but is culturally acceptable in their country.
Are you thinking Thursday nights in Afghanistan? Is that what we're talking about? Okay.
So what should they do?
So what do they do? What do we tell them to do?
Yes.
Right, okay. So that's really sticky, and I appreciate the question, and I don't think there's a right answer or a solution. I can tell you that I'm not on the training staff, I'm on the education, so I don't tend to do that, but we've gotten a lot of pushback about that very thing. How on earth can you expect us to go over there, or Marines to go over there and witness that and not do something about it? And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that we always try to repeat is that we're not there to change, you know what I mean, their values. We can't. We would love to, but we can't. How do they respond to it? Do they, use chain of command? Again,
Explain the Thursday night thing. I don't
Oh.
know. I didn't get that. What is that reference?
I don't know if we're talking about the same. Go ahead.
yeah. So the Thursday night in Afghanistan, in some parts of Afghanistan, it is customary for men to take young boys age 9 or 10 and have sex and forcibly rape them. And it's not, of course, accepted everywhere, but yeah, Sheila, please expand.
So what we teach them is to report it through the chain of command.
Chain of command, yeah.
Because through their own religion, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Although culturally acceptable in certain areas, it's not acceptable, and then it's turned over to the Afghans to take action with pressure, hopefully, from our side. But it used to be, we didn't teach them anything about going over there, but now it's reported through the chain of command when you see something that's wrong, because it may not be wrong in the culture, but it could be wrong against international law. You just, and that's what you got your lawyers for, right, Jody?
Jody. Yeah, Jody says no.
But report it through the chain of command.
But I truly appreciate your question, because so many of these, I would say young kids, they're 22, strategic sergeant, as they say, right? They're faced with this and they're not prepared for it. And no one thinks it's their job to prepare them for it, right? Except for maybe, fellow Marines who have been there and done it before. But we don't take ownership. No one wants to get near it with a 10-foot pole. We don't know. I appreciate the question, but I don't think anyone has the answer to that. We've read about it in the papers, right? When soldiers or Marines have attacked, have beaten up guys when they've caught them doing that, and they get kicked out of the Army. They get kicked out of the Marines. So what does right look like? Even here, if we see something in our own communities that we think is disgusting or, terrible, what do we do? I think on a case-by-case basis, it's something we just have to be able to live in the gray a little bit on that one. Because, again, nobody has the answer to it. But thank you for the question.
Appreciate it, though. Thanks.
Yeah.
Chloe?
Yes, my question is for Kerry. When you talk about the branching, are you talking about doing risk analysis and programs of the such, like in Excel and probability or?
Question. So in this case, we're
scenarios?
thinking more along the lines of sort of a HTML5 object. So in this case, they wouldn't really be given a lot of technical information. It'd be more like you're a leader of a certain department and this thing happens. Here's a little bit of background on it. Go, what would you do next? So an example of this is it's a little bit different than leadership. We did this for the Perkins School for the Blind. And it was a course that we were designing on inclusive talent development. And so it was essentially, it was a MOOC, a massive open online course, that we offered that basically was supposed to help hiring managers and HR folks think about how to actually find and recruit people that have some kind of either a visual impairment or maybe a hearing impairment or something, and basically to think through what to do when you're interviewing those folks. And so often people are really unprepared for that. They don't really know. And so you don't know coming into it if someone's going to walk into your office to interview and they maybe have a visual impairment. And so there's a lot of questions that people tend to ask that actually are not okay to ask. Like, will you be able to do this job if you can't see, right? People are like, oh, you can't ask that. But there are ways that you can talk about that a little bit. And so the hope for this scenario was that in this case, we did it with really beautiful imagery. We had our artist work on it. And so you got to know the person that was the hiring manager, and you got to know the person that had the visual impairment. And so you sort of learned their backstories. And then they met, and then as the manager, you have to decide what you would do when this person comes in. And so the thing is, there's no right or wrong answer, but we polled a lot of people that had visual impairments, and we said, if somebody chose, for example, you see this person, they have a visual impairment, do you say, why don't I take your arm and I'll lead you to a conference room? Or do you say, oh, why don't we sit down here in the lobby and have this conversation? So both of which are acceptable, but when we polled everyone, we actually found out that people with visual impairments felt like, well, what the heck? Everyone else gets to go to the conference room. Why are you treating me differently? And so some hiring managers were like, whoa, I thought I was doing this really nice thing by making it easier, but it's not the same treatment. And so, again, neither one are right or wrong, but when people selected that sort of wrong answer in the case, they're like, whoa, I had no idea that that's what I was doing. And so it's really designed more toward those sort of real life scenarios where it gets you thinking like, oh, I had never thought of that before. And so in this case, it was sort of just a series of those.
How are you quantifying that? Are you doing like the economics way of like strategy games and like giving a certain value to your decision, or?
So it depends. We can do that way.
Okay.
We do have an economics gaming class where we do something really similar. But in this case, what we did was we actually just had we did it mostly by polling community members.
Okay.
So that one was pretty sort of this way or that way, and it was more storytelling based as opposed to being more rooted in actual economics for that one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I had a real quick question, and it may be applicable across all three areas, because it's really, teaching is great, but it's the retention and then the follow-up and the implementation of it, because I've been in a lot of DoD classes, and we get a lot of classwork, and then I assume it's the same with the Marine Corps, that, you go to the class, but then how do you take that back, and then how do you retain it, and then how do you teach them how to employ it later on? Those skill sets, I think, are the still lacking.
So I'm not on the panel, but I have,
Go ahead.
I have
I have an opinion too.
go ahead, Admiral, you go first.
But I think
Please.
what you're talking about there is, and it's the constant mixing of education and training. You're talking about training.
That's
It's not
true.
about education.
Okay.
So education is a mind-broadening exercise. So there's no skills. There is knowledge that bring a constant introspection about what you do and who you are and how you interact. That prepares you to deal with the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what the context needs to be. Otherwise, and that's our problem. Culturally, where's the checklist? Right?
Yeah,
Okay, just
right.
give me the checklist. I understand the checklist, I'll try the checklist. Bam, good, right? But so that's that transition into strategic thinking. And strategic leadership is there's no checklist. There's no checklist. There's the unknown. There's we could have had an NDP government in Canada at the last election, and what does that mean for defense? You need to prepare for that. You need to game it to say, okay, so we need to be ready for that. We ended up with a different government that did something totally unexpected in the funding of defense. That's more what we expected of a conservative government, for example. We're all surprised. But so, that's that level, but it's that field of unknown, so
That's seriously exactly what I was going to say. And it was actually one of the biggest fights when I arrived in the institution was to differentiate between the two. Because we're offering a master's degree. And I remember I made what I learned real early that I didn't realize in the military is if you come up with a kind of a really cool saying or model, it will come back to haunt you for the next 13 years. And so I talked about the differentiation between education and training, and it became actually an arguing point as we created new curriculum, and get them out of that mindset that we're not doing, we want you to have ideas for when you have it's not even complexity, when you have a situation that requires thinking, right? Not just application, but thinking and putting thoughts together. So, yeah.
In the military, you were to follow your commander, like there's chain of command, versus out of the military, say government affairs, so you're appointed ambassador. Of course, there's the president's policy. So how do you say, I'm broadening your mind at the War College, you go back to your command, and you have these ideas, and you're trying to use them critically, but you have a chain of command to go through. You follow orders.
You answer. I have an answer to that too,
No,
as
go
an
ahead.
academic.
Go first, and then we'll see
Okay.
if we're thinking the same thing.
So a lot of times the students, I'm in the line, I'm at the upper line level, right, a senior professor. I'm not running any programs anymore. But you find in the classroom as a faculty member that the students will come back to you, especially the younger ones, not the ones that are there in what we call the senior curriculum, which is a more advanced group. Like the colonel right there might be in our senior curriculum. Major Grigg would be in our intermediate curriculum. She's got about 15 years in the military, right, and the others have 20 plus years. So the experiential level is very different. So a lot of times in that intermediate class, the students will literally ask me, if I took that idea to my senior officer, they would tell me to shut up and color. And so that's part of the education. Okay, you think it's any different in the business world I came from? It's not. You have like a really misperception of what organizations are like. How do you present an idea in a positive way to someone that is leading you? What is it about them that you can parallel? We literally go through this, and I make them practice. If they're crazy enough to ask me that, I make them practice in class. Like, you're his senior officer. You tell him, and senior officer, you rebut him at every point, or her, and see what happens. Let's see how do we get around this. It is no different in business. There is not a formal chain of command, but there is definitely what the military would call a chain of command.
So
A hierarchy, right.
So there's a line of authority, and like at that level, it's really what it is. So I know there's a perception to chain of command, say, Frank says do so because he's up in the chain of command, and you just shut up and do it. There's great models of very colorful illustration of how that's not really what it works, or if it works, what kind of silly things people do. So at the end of the day, the leader makes a decision based on the best advice that he's or she has received. Sometimes it's not the right advice. And if you remember, if you were there for my opening comment, I didn't formulate it that way, but I talk about submarine incidents, and you talk about marine incidents, talk about air industry incidents. When you don't have a healthy climate of challenge and reply, where, oh, sir, I don't think you had all the information. I think you were missing that piece of information. And they say, oh, you're right, I didn't have that. Now my outcome, my decision is now different because I have one more piece of the puzzle. It's a dynamic piece. So there's always opportunity as long as the leader is open and has a healthy culture of, I'm not perfect, it's okay. You put your ego aside. Some are more stringent. But the majority of folks who have balanced experience and have spent some time, do some deep introspection, know that the only thing that makes them a good leader is the strength of the team and the recommendations you get from them. So there's always occasions to say, I don't think he had all the pieces. Eventually, and I may say, yes, I had that piece, but that's why I made that decision, and then you get buy-in, hopefully, because you had a logical process to make the decision. So, there's a lot of, you spend a lot, actually, we just spend a few days guiding a very senior officer that was initially for us participating in an initiative and say, we shouldn't, that's political activism, we're not allowed to do it, we'll be in a conflict of interest, and then we'll lose legitimacy in trying to move certain element of the important people agenda that we had. And it took some time, but because we, you use influence models, you use national strategic decision-making models, say what's the interest of the decision maker, how do you influence it, and you go there. So there's a way to do it.
One more question if we have any more, and then we'll close out. Go ahead, Admiral.
No,
Okay.
it's okay, I can ask that.
This? No. Okay, so I've had one really great trip over here with this group from the Nevada National Guard for the Women, Peace, and Security Program in Tonga. It was the best team I've ever worked with, and that's really saying something. I've had a long career of teams. They're the best. Syra was on that team, Randy Lau, Colonel Greg back there, or Colonel, I just promoted you. Oh, right. We know that's where she's headed. Major and the two majors back here were part of that team. So that's one thing I did. I had a fantastic trip to London. That's worth not your time in here, but I can chat with you about that. It was one of those weird things where I'm going to this specific institution to get this research on a specific woman that was captured in World War II in Singapore. And it was the worst part of the entire trip. And I kept tumbling into backroom books and priests and Harry Potter stairways and all kinds of crazy things. And I got that was the best part of the sabbatical so far. But yeah, I've mostly been working, so tomorrow, I'm not kidding. I'm off the grid. Totally. Thanks, Sheila. Anything else?
I have a question. So when we teach women, peace, and security, we all know this is a very controversial topic. It's a difficult topic. There is resistance. There is pushback. How do we measure the impact of the transformation we're bringing about? Because without that evidence, it's very difficult to keep going. Because there is so much criticism of the agenda.
Well, boy, do we have a one-pager for you. Right up there. I really hope seriously that our annotated bibliography will help to shine some light on just exactly what the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is accomplishing and how effective it is for security and peace operations around the world. And I seriously encourage all of you to take copies of our one-pager because I think it's an important cheat sheet for anybody who's still on the fence about the effectiveness of women, peace, and security in a gender perspective.
Are you happy for us to put those on our websites?
Absolutely, yeah. Happy. I can share it with the whole email list if you'd like.
That'd
be great. Fantastic, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to.
Encourage taking women out and replacing it with gender, so more men to participate in WPS programs like Georgetown, for instance, has a nice program as do other schools. So how do we entice the other 50% to engage or to take courses in those curriculums?
So. And I'd welcome other people to chime in here because I'm still relatively new to this space. I was speaking with David back there at lunch about the importance of including men in this agenda as well. And actually from my own experience, and I don't know if I've just been lucky to interact with some really engaged individuals, but my perception has been that once you start having a conversation, the interest and the motivation to get on board is pretty much immediate. And as Mary mentioned in her introductory remarks, we just started a new initiative, really, with Ambassador Don Steinberg called Mobilizing Male Allies for Women, Peace, and Security. And the amount of positive feedback that we've had from high-level men across the peace and security realm who want to be involved, who want to help open doors for women in this space, who want to help engage and ally with women's organizations and women peace builders on the ground and women policymakers. It's astounding and it's heartwarming and it's really, really exciting. So I would say just start the conversation and see where it takes you.
And I agree, in my space I find that easy, but I would say, how do I approach my 15-year-old son when he's going to school to take those courses in university? Because that's where we're going to see significant change from engaging with that age group versus older age groups.
I don't. Do any parents in the room want to?
Yeah, the checklist.
I'll work on that. That'll be next.
Okay, the last one.
So I just wanted to Lauren, you made a really interesting adjustment with the empathy piece. And I think it's really insightful because you really have to know who you're teaching and the identity they carry with them and the socialization they go through by the time you get to them in order to address the WPS agenda and have it received in a way that isn't creating a bigger problem than when you initially started. Because we were having this conversation, it could be very subversive. Depending on your audience, the audience that you're teaching. So I think you've come up with some interesting ways of negotiating that
Through the back door.
Yeah, and
Not as explicit.
And I think that's an important conversation to have as well. And I'd be interested to hear what other things what other mechanisms you've used.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can go into more offline with you, but absolutely. Like my test questions, I always have scenario-based test questions, situational judgment tests that you mentioned earlier. The female is always the lead, right? And then I just try to work it in a way that makes it seem natural and not forced. That's my, the way I try to get at it. So scenarios are always in that vein for online teaching and residence teaching. But yeah, I think coming at it with people very directly sometimes doesn't work in where I work, but I can't speak for everybody. It's just, I have to be careful about the context. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we're going to close it down. I have a few closing comments. Thank you very much. Thank you.